Matt. It's my pleasure to be here today with Dr. Mark Katakowski. As a brief introduction, Mark is president of the longevity company Forever Labs and was the first to demonstrate that microRNA functions as a communication molecule between brain tumor cells. He is a medical physicist with extensive experience developing stem cell therapies for neurological disease and injury. He's come to Google today to talk about rejuvenating bone marrow and its significant opportunity to combat aging. He also just might live forever. Dr. Mark Katakowski, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, John. And thanks for coming today. So yeah, my name is Mark Katakowski. That's my first birthday there. And I'm the president of Forever Labs. We're a longevity company, as John said. And we're based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Currently we're out here in Mountain View, though, because we're in the summer class of Y Combinator. And so we've been operational for about a year and a half. We started. I bank. And so what we do is we bank adult stem cells and then cryopreserve them for future therapy. And we also are working on developing some of these therapies for which to use these cells in. And so I'm gonna kind of talk about what we're doing and why we think it's the good time to do it, and why we've decided to disrupt our lives and make this happen. But I'm going to talk about kind of the greater context that we're doing within. I think I powerfully believe that there is a change coming in healthcare and how we provide medical services. And I'm going to talk about what I see happening, what's happening now, and where things are going. In addition to that, and I've kind of structured this talk as kind of like the arc of my own scientific career for the last 15 years, because what I've been doing largely reflects my thoughts on what should be done, so I'm gonna talk about that, and so that's kind of like and then at the end I just want to kind of wax philosophical about the space in general and what it means to actually have be a longevity company. So first I want to talk about is an issue we don't like to think about too much. So how do we die? After about middle age, in middle age, we start to die of causes that are quite similarly related. They're called age-related diseases, and so that's heart disease, and the #1 killer, and cancer, which is the #2 if you put them all together, and stroke, and lung disease, dementia. And all these, they're age-related diseases, and all these diseases, what they have in common is they are caused by a dysfunction at the cellular level, which leads to dysfunction at the tissue level, which leads to systemic failure. And so you have some, like a blood clot that goes to the brain. It builds up a blood clot, goes to the brain, and you have this stroke. That's the age-related disease. Or in cancer, you have cellular dysfunction that leads to tumorigenesis, and then you develop this cancer. And we've actually, when I was putting this data together, though, I noticed something interesting, that traffic accidents kind of surprised me. 15 to 24, 25 to 35. Traffic accidents are a really leading cause of death in the youth. And I think that if we can get cars that drive better than we do, then we're going to have some serious improvements in healthcare for youth. So somebody should work on that. So we die by age-related disease now. We have the privilege to do that because I'm going to move to some. So this is cancer incidence in the United States. And you can see, as you get older, your chance of getting cancer go up dramatically. And we know why that is. That's because when you get older, you've accumulated more mutations, more damage in your cells, and they start to build up, and you get a cascading effect. And what also happens at this time in life is that you start to have a decline in your immune function. Your immune system does not survey for cancer, for precancerous tissue, and as well as it used to. And the immune system plays a very important role in preventing tumorigenesis in cancer. And interestingly, so in the last 100 or so years, or if you go back more than 100 years ago, rather, cancer wasn't something many people got the chance to experience because we would die of infection, or we would die in childbirth. And cancer is a fairly new disease in the sense that we have, through antibiotics and better early health care, we've been able to live to this point where we start to fall apart and we develop cancer. So we fall apart. and that's age-related disease. So what are we doing about it? What are we doing about it right now? Well, so what is healthcare right now? If you look, I looked in the Oxford English Dictionary, and healthcare was first used, it's a pretty new term. It was used by the US government in a pamphlet called Healthcare for Children in about 1940. And then the definition that I found in the Merriam-Webster dictionary was the maintenance and improvement of physical and mental health, especially through the provision of medical services. And so the maintenance improvement of physical and mental health. So I take issue with that. I don't think that's a very good definition for healthcare, at least as we practice it. So, and I'll tell you why. We spend, in the United States, 90% of our healthcare funding goes towards the treatment of age-related disease. So 90% goes towards this point where we have a dysfunction. And it's actually, I would argue, we spend our money on the restoration of health. Medicare spending in the United States, and to illustrate that, Medicare spending in the United States, 30% of Medicare spending goes to just 5% of the beneficiaries that are going to die this year in any given year. So 30% goes to the 5% that is dying in that year. And of that 30% of the Medicare spending, a third of that actually goes to those people, those patients in the last month of life. And so what more accurately describes what healthcare is today is an attempt to restore health that's been lost, and not a very rational attempt, because the more desperate the fight gets, the more desperate the battle, the more money, the more resources we plow into it. And especially in the last month of life, when the problem's almost retractable, that's when we put the most resources into this. And that, I think, is what healthcare is today. I think this definition actually better defines what healthcare is going to be in the future. I say that because we are developing technologies that are enabling us to work with our biology in very subtle ways to actually do maintenance and improvement on a cellular level. And by doing so, we're able to prevent the dysfunction of cells, and we're also able to actually sometimes undo some dysfunction in cells and restore the health on the cellular level. And if you can do that, well then you don't have systems failure, or you can prevent systems failure, and you have an economic incentive to put money up front where you can do a lot of good with little money. And the economics are absolutely going to just drive this transition from this disease treatment type of healthcare that we have now to a maintenance of health type of healthcare that we're going to have. And so, like I said, I'm going to talk about my experience and how I've come to this, how I've come to the, where I'm at in Forever Labs, why we're providing the service we are, and with my own scientific, kind of story. So it starts 15 years ago. In 2001, I had just graduated. I got my bachelor's in physics, and I was a little bit burned out programming Fortran, and I wanted to get my hands dirty, and I wanted to do some science where I love to work with my hands. I wanted to do some science where I could, do some more experimental stuff. And at that time, I was introduced to a scientist. He was a professor of physics, actually, that turned biologist, but he's also is a very preeminent stroke researcher. His name's Michael Chop. And he had a lab. He was a vice chair of neurology at Henry Ford Hospital in Michigan, in Detroit. And I sat down with him. He was looking at bringing on graduate students. And he told me what they were doing in their lab is they were working on new treatments for stroke, new therapies for stroke. And you're going to have to bear with me because I'm going to talk a bit about stroke here. But stroke, I think, as is an age-related disease, a lot of what I say to stroke is like how we used to treat it, how we're trying to treat it now, and how we're going to treat it in the future, all applies to other age-related diseases. This is my own personal experience. This is how I got to where I'm at today. And so Michael, he described to me the current state of stroke treatment. And that was, there was one drug, one FDA-approved treatment for stroke. It was approved 5 years prior to that. It's called TPA, and it simply just is an enzyme. It's tissue plasminogen activator. It's simply an enzyme that dissolves a clot. When you have a stroke, 87% of strokes are ischemic, and you need to dissolve this clot because the clot blocks blood flow to the brain. The brain needs a lot of energy and a lot of oxygen, and it dies very quickly. And so TPA simply says it dissolves this clot and to save the brain. But TPA has two serious limitations. One, you've got to get it quick because your brain dies quickly. And two, TPA, because of its mechanism of action, can turn a ischemic, a blood clot stroke into what we call a hemorrhagic stroke, where you get a brain bleed and you've just exacerbated the problem. And at that time, in 2001, about 5% of patients that were eligible to actually be helped by this drug were getting it. And so this is the third leading cause of death. And we could maybe help 5% of people that were having this. And so what Michael was working on, he told me, is they were working on, could they treat stroke after this phase? We knew at the time, we know that after your brain has an injury, it does heal itself to an extent. There is a production of new neurons. There is new blood vessel growth. There is induction of neuroplasticity, which means the neurons that do exist, they start to make new connections and try to compensate for the loss. And Michael said, well, if we can improve that, if we can improve that natural ability for the brain to heal itself, well, then we have something that we could at least treat everybody that survives a stroke. And the way they did that, the way they were starting at that time, was they were looking at stem cells. And I'm sure everybody's heard of what a stem cell is. But the definition of what a stem cell is it's a cell that can do two important things. One, divide almost indefinitely. I don't know if you've heard of telomeres, but at the end of your DNA, after the cell division, your DNA will get shorter and shorter and shorter in a normal cell until the cell malfunctions and dies. But stem cells express an enzyme called telomerase, which will extend the telomeres on the cells, and they can divide almost indefinitely. And the other important thing that stem cells can do is they can divide into multiple tissue types. And the one I'm going to talk about one stem cell quite a bit, is the mesenchymal stem cell of the bone marrow. And the mesenchymal stem cell can differentiate into bone and cartilage and muscle. And so that's what makes it a stem cell. But there's a third characteristic that doesn't define stem cells, but something they generally have. And that is that they have a powerful influence on the tissue around them. Typically what that means, especially in the context of injury, it means they can promote healing, they can regulate inflammation so it's appropriate, and they can recruit new blood vessel growth. And so that's why they were looking at stem cells to improve the healing after stroke. And the stem cell they were looking at was this mesenchymal stem cell. And actually, I'll say we were looking at, because that's when I decided to join the lab and get to work with this. And the mesenchymal stem cell we chose that for two reasons. One, you have a lot of them. The adult body has a lot of mesenchymal stem cells. They're in your bone marrow. They're easy to collect. They're very easy to expand to large numbers, therapeutic numbers. But two, they have a very powerful influence upon tissue around them. Mesenchymal stem cells make copious amounts of soluble factors that will decrease inflammation and promote regeneration. And so that's why we were looking at, can we use these cells to treat stroke after it happened? And we started and we did these experiments where we found we could grow bone mesenchymal stem cells and treat mice or rats with them. And we got what we thought were pretty amazing results. So we treated these animals just intravenously, just injecting the mesenchymal stem cell into their bloodstream after the stroke. And those animals that were treated, so after they had the stroke, they'd have this motor deficits. They would lose function. They would also have cognitive deficits that we could measure through a battery of tests. And these animals that were treated with the cells, they would recover much more readily, and they would recover to a greater extent than those animals that weren't treated. And coincident with that, we looked in the brain, and we would see an increase in new neurons after the treatment. We would see an increase in synaptic plasticity, even far away in the contralateral part of the brain. This mesenchymal stem cell treatment improved the plasticity and learning of the injured rat, and we'd see blood vessel growth, smaller scar in the brain. So this was exciting. We had this. We developed this thing that maybe we could treat more and more people with, and other labs took interest and started to do this and actually repeat our results, and things moved from there. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me on stroke, because I'm almost out of it. 15 years later now, so this is 15 years now later, and at last count, there's 14 registered clinical trials using mesenchymal stem cell therapy for the treatment of stroke in humans. And I highlighted two that I think are particularly interesting. One is this top one. It's going on at Stanford. This Dr. Gary Steinberg. He's taking these cells and he's injecting them directly into the brain around the damaged area. And there's two things interesting about the trial. One, there's people in this trial that got the treatment, and they had hemiparalysis. They had loss of limb function, and they actually were gaining limb function. The thing that makes it very interesting to me is that he was treating these people sometimes 6 to 12 months out after the stroke happened. And that's really chronic. And often it's thought, you can do some physical therapy and speech therapy and whatnot to try to recover. But 12 months out, what you have then is often thought to be what you're going to get back. And to be able to effect a change at that point is pretty stunning. And so they're moving on to the next phase. And then this other trial here is going on in South Korea. And I highlighted it for 2 reasons. One, it's phase 3, so it's pretty far along. But the other is that they're doing something interesting with the cells, which kind of illustrates what can be done. So one thing we found early on in our work is that we found that if you prep the mesenchymal stem cell, if we introduce the mesenchymal stem cell to an injury area, it changes its behavior and it upregulates its production of a lot of these factors that promote healing. And they are actually, in their human trial, what they're doing is they're taking the cells and they're treating them, they're growing them out, but at the same time they're exposing them to the plasma of the stroked patient that they took them from, and to prep the cells and kind of advance them and get them ready for the treatment. So I thought that was pretty cool. And this is actually not just stroke. A lot of labs recognize the therapeutic potential of mesenchymal stem cells and been using them for the treatment of age-related diseases like heart disease and bone and cartilage, neurological disease, even other neurological diseases like Alzheimer's. We use it for traumatic brain injury too. It's a pretty good effect. There's a trial in Houston doing that. And so that's to say, mesenchymal stem cell therapy has really advanced, and it's really given options where there were few. Well, but there's a problem, okay? So, and it's some problem we recognized pretty early, and others did too. So we have these cells, they've got this therapeutic potential, but your stem cell numbers and function decline as you get older. So 10 years from now, you're going to have less stem cells than you have in you now. And the ones that you do have have less therapeutic potential, and they're just going to have a decrease in function. The graph here on the left demonstrates this. One study was looking at just counting the number of circulating blood progenitor cells and this vascular progenitor cells in the blood, and just counting the number, and that decreases with donor age. There's an interesting study that's kind of related. The University of Messina in Italy, they took 80-year-olds, and they just counted the circulating stem cells in their blood and just counted them, and then they revisited those individuals 7 years later, and they actually found that the number of stem cells, the concentration circulating in their blood, was predictive of whether or not that individual was going to be alive 7 years later. And they said that that might be an interesting biomarker for longevity. The graph on the right here, we've got mesenchymal stem cells, and we're just looking at the bone-building potential of the cells. I said they can build bone. They can become bone-building cells, and that decreases. That potential decreases with age. Here's another showing mesenchymal stem cell decline with age. This is just looking at proliferation of the cells. This top line, this graph is just growing. This is just growing them in culture and seeing how readily they proliferate. And you've got 2 to 12-year-old child cells, and they grow quite readily to great numbers. And you can expand these too. Since they're exponential growth, you can get lots and lots of cells. Like really, a pound of cells from not so many. But if you look down at the bottom line, those are older donors. That's 60 to 70-year-old donors, and they don't grow as quick, and they don't grow as much. And you can see after like 9 passages, they just stop. And we call that senescence. If somebody gives me, whether it's a mouse or a rat or a monkey or whatever, a human cell, mesenchymal stem cell, and they've given me 2 different ones, and they're saying they're different ages, I can tell them really quick which one's which, because it's pretty striking the difference between the cells' functionality. And so that's bad, but this turns to senescence here, where these old ones stop. It's actually thought to be supposed to be a beneficial thing too, because these cells have become damaged over time. And a stem cell, because of its ability to divide infinitely and to influence the tissue around it, it can be a risk factor for cancer. A lot of cancers are caused by stem cells gone awry. And so it's thought that the senescence, what these cells will do is they'll slow down, they'll turn themselves off. Often they'll just commit suicide. But often, actually, they'll just kind of hang out too. And because they're just kind of given bad, and they give like bad vibes to the tissue around it. And actually, it's a problem. So, all right. So I was working in this stroke lab. We had this great therapy, and I was, maybe it's moving to the clinic. But there's this problem. The stem cells that we're using are declining, and when you're more likely to have a stroke, all your stem cells have gone downhill. And so my buddy that was a colleague of mine, and he's our chief science officer, Dr. Ben Bowler, and I, we'd often talk about this stuff, and we said, well, we should do something about that. That's, and there's something you can do really easy. You just like take them and send them forward in time. You just take the young cells, and you send them to your future self, and use them when you're old. And that's easy, and you don't even need DeLoreans. You just do what we call as a heterochronic transplant. Don't mention metachlorians. So what we do is it's called a heterochronic transplantation. And so you just cryopreserve the cells. We've been doing that for a long time. It's a matter of course in the lab. I've grown cells that are more than 40 years old. Once at liquid nitrogen, the cells are biologically inert. As long as you freeze them carefully and as long as you thaw them carefully, the time in between doesn't matter so much. Actually, you start to think about background radiation if you want to keep them for a long time. And there's been successful bone marrow transplants, one of the oldest stem cell therapies there is, with cells that were frozen for more than 20 years. So, okay, we could take our cells, our young cells, and freeze them for older self. And when I talk to people about this, the question that always gets is, well, why not allogenic? Why can't you just take someone else's young cells and just treat yourself? You don't have to even worry about that then. Well, the answer to this immunity is crazy, and the complete answer to this is that it is very complicated. But a general answer to this is that your immunity is unique, and you have to overcome obstacles to do this allogenic transfer. Now, on your 6th chromosome, there's this big cluster of about 250 genes that is called the HLA, or the major histocompatibility complex. And what it does is it says, this is me, and if another cell expresses a different one, it says it's not me, and your body tries to kill it. If you want to regenerate tissue, if you want to incorporate tissue long-term in your body, you typically need your own cells, or you need to modulate the immune response. And often that means immunosuppressants. Well, so if you've heard in bone marrow donation, what they're doing is they're donating these hematopoietic stem cells that are in the bone marrow, and what you'll do is, and those actually are cells that give rise to an immune system, and what they'll do is, for the recipient has to actually get the immune system wiped out, and then they'll put in a new one from the donor, and they try to get a perfect match, but even then it runs a very high risk, and it's very dangerous because that immune system that comes in might recognize the recipient as the foreign body, and then you get this thing called graft versus host disease, where the donor's marrow attacks the recipient, and it's very deadly. And so they'll take immune suppressants to prevent that. Same thing in organ donation. People take immune suppressants. And like I said, the immune system is very important for the prevention of cancer. And those people that are recipients of organ donation, they have a much higher incidence of cancer. You might remember there was in France about 5 years ago, there was a first successful face transplant. Well, that woman, actually, she died just recently of multiple cancers. She was on very powerful immune suppressants. So it's not an ideal situation. But to be honest, there's some ways you can get around it, and there's some ways that sometimes. And I'll talk about the mesenchymal stem cell, because about 1/3 of trials using mesenchymal stem cells are allogenic, like this. And the reason was, the thinking was, well, they don't express this major histocompatibility complex number 2, and they don't really tell the recipient's body, hey, we are foreign. And so you can get this therapeutic effect. But what's more come to light and recently is that they actually, when you put them in the body, they do start to express this thing, and they don't elicit a big immune reaction, but they do get wiped out. They do disappear. And kind of evidence of this, so the trial at Stanford that I mentioned, they're actually using allogenic cells and putting them directly in the brain. And they looked 2 months later, and the cells were gone. I'm not sure if they were the patient's own cells, if they'd still be there. That would have to be tested. But they were gone, and it begs the question, would they have had a more persistent, could they have even got more if they use cells of the patient's own immunogenicity? But definitely, if you want to replace tissue, if you want to get new tissue, you need your own cells are by far the best. And it's not so simple as just deleting this piece of DNA. There's a lot of non-coding genes in there that are regulating things. And there's actually genes in here that are important for infection and other functions. So nothing is generally that simple. So that's why not allogenic. All right, so we talked about this, and you could save your young cells, but here we're treating this age-related disease, right? And you save young cells, and to treat something catastrophic that happens later in life. But the evidence started to point that maybe this stroke, we know this, maybe the stroke isn't just because it doesn't, we can attack it earlier. Like, so when I was talking to our CEO and I was putting this slide together, I was talking about TPA and how we still have TPA is still the only one FDA-approved drug for treatment of stroke in the United States. So this is 21 years later. And it's not for lack of trying. The NINDS budget was a National Institute of Neural Disorder and Stroke budget last year was $1.7 billion. But he said, yeah, Steve was like, well, what do we do? And I said, just don't have a stroke. That's what you do. And honestly, I think that's what Ben and I, my colleague and I, were starting to think, like, can we prevent this? Can you get ahead of it? And there's a lot of similarities in age-related disease. And age-related disease is not a fact of all life. I think a lot of people just think life, death, this is just part of the natural process. But they aren't two sides of the same coin. Amoebas and other singular cellular organisms, they don't necessarily age. So an amoeba, when it divides, you don't have a young amoeba and an old amoeba. You have two amoebas, they're the same age. Amoebas get around the problem by just fixing damage faster than it happens. They can fix the wear and tear of life faster than it occurs. And so an amoeba is really just like an ageless organism. Hydras are also, they're interesting. They're a multicellular organism, and there's no increase in mortality with hydras as time goes by. And they're actually interesting. They're just chock full of stem cells. They're almost like stem cell trees. And so there are these creatures that don't experience aging, but multicellular organisms, they tend to. But it does beg the question, and this is something that we were often talking about. Does this have to happen? Does this decline have to happen? If we could do like the amoeba, and we can do maintenance on a low cellular level, and could we prevent the aging process in humans? We do this in our cars. I mean, classic cars, not far from our office in Ann Arbor. I can go to the Henry Ford Museum, and I can take a ride in a Model T that was built more than 100 years ago. So anyway, we were kicking around this problem. We knew the cells that had to be saved for later because they were losing this important properties. And then, this is 2012, we got this call. We got this call for grants from the NIH, this call for applications. And when you're a researcher, you write a lot of grants. That's your life. And it's a brutal process when you're writing grants, because half of the grants you submit aren't even discussed. They're not even, they get to the, you get it back and it says not discussed. And so you don't even get feedback. You don't even know what was bad or what was good. They just don't even. And so it's almost like you spend a month writing the grant, doing research, and then you just pick it up and drop it in the waste bin and then move forward. Like, that's what the feeling. So anyway, so we got this grant, and this grant was funny. It said, give us your craziest idea. You don't have to write a big proposal. Just a short 1 or 2 pages. It was like just your craziest idea you're thinking of, something that you wouldn't write a proposal on otherwise. We want something that's, kind of all bang. And what so Ben and I, we often laughed at acronyms that scientists use, because we'll give acronyms to genes or proteins to explain like the first thing that we saw it do, and then everybody finds other things that it does, and it confuses everybody because they named it after something, some functionality. Anyway, this grant was called Eureka, and that's actually an acronym. It was extraordinary. Extraordinary unconventional research enabling knowledge acceleration. And we laughed at it. One thing, it's not even grammatically correct. Like, you can't accelerate knowledge. You can accelerate the acquisition of knowledge, but that's like throwing a book, It just it doesn't make sense. So we were like, well, that's great. Let's do this idea. Let's use young cells, and we'll try to treat aging itself. Like, we know that there's a decline in the cellular niche, in the bone marrow niche, and so we said the stem cell niche. And so we said, what if we just simply take these young MSCs and we take genetically matched mice, which you can do, and we take young ones and we give them to old ones, and will they have increased health span if we prevent the decline of the niche? Will they have increased lifespan? And so we submitted this proposal to this Eureka grant, and probably not the best idea. We decided to come up with the worst acronym, and we called it BATH-3. We called it Bone Marrow Autologous Transplantation Helping the Old Regain Youth. And if you're a student of history, Lady Bathory was a a homicidal Hungarian noblewoman that would bathe in the blood of her young victims just to live forever. So you could tell I was starting to get burned out at this point in my career. So whether by we did actually get, it was discussed, so that's good. But we didn't get the grant. Maybe that was our sense of humor that prevented it. But interesting, yeah, one of the things too, I'll never forget the review of that grant, because one of the reviewers said that our idea didn't use enough technology. And I thought, what does that even mean? If you take something that you have, if you take everything you have and you use it in a new way, that's the definition of innovation. But they weren't interested in it. I guess we should have put lasers on it. So in researching this grant, though, we came across something that was really interesting to me. So at the University of Texas in Arlington, there was a group, and they asked a very similar question. They were looking at bone, but they said, what if we use young bone marrow cell, mesenchymal stem cells, and we transplanted these to older mice? How would they fare? Would they have, because they were looking at osteoporosis, the loss of bone density over time. And they said, would this prevent the onset of osteoporosis or slow it down? And they found, indeed, it did slow it down when they did this. And these are genetically matched mice, so it's kind of like a twin kind of transplant. And but to their surprise, serendipitously, they also found that the mice that they transplanted to lived longer. And they did an age match transplant as well. They took old MSCs and gave them to old mice, and they didn't live longer. And so that said the youthfulness of the cells was important to this effect. And that really started to chew away at me. I was like, this is something that we should be pursuing. This is something that's worth looking into more. And then a year after we got the grant rejected, there was another group that just did whole bone marrow, young whole bone marrow, and transplanted it to older genetically matched mice. And those mice, they reported lived longer. And that was about it. I was on a phone call with some business-minded friends, our CEO, Steve, here, and I said, I'm not mad I didn't get the grant. I'm not mad I didn't get the first paper, but I'm turning 40 this year. I want to store my cells. I want to put my cells aside. And he said, well, that's something I'd like to do too. And we started to talk about it. And one thing led to another. So we met with an orthopedic surgeon, who's now our chief medical officer, award-winning orthopedic surgeon. And he said, you know what? I'm already taking bone marrow. He's like, I'm already doing bone marrow aspirations. What they do is they'll take it out and they'll concentrate it, and then they'll inject it at the site of injury or after our surgery to promote healing. And so we realized, there was an on-ramp for this idea. And now, so what we're doing, here's Steve. He was the third person to bank. I was number two. Number one was our CSO, because he's a hockey player. And here's Steve. He's like, had it done. It's really, really pretty minor. And so what we do now is we credential orthopedic surgeons, sports medicine, and plastic surgeons generally. And to do this bone marrow aspiration and collection, it's pretty simple. It's outpatient, in and out in 15 minutes, and you got your stem cells. Well, we keep those. But, and so we did this. We went operational about, and we're 15 months ago. And now we're in 7 states. And so there's more to it, though. So we're not just collecting. We're actually doing the experiment we wanted to do. We're running that right now. We're doing the heterochronic transplantation of young MSCs to older mice, and we're going to see if it improves their health span. Because we're neurologists, we're looking at also their cognitive health as well, and we're going to see if we can slow the onset of cognitive decline. And so it's really, I'm excited to find out whether we can make this work, and if we can make it work, can we improve upon it? One of the issues when you're dealing with therapy is you always have dose and delivery. You need the therapy to go where it needs to work, not where it doesn't, and you need it to go there at a therapeutically effective dose. And I mentioned, there's a number of really interesting technologies they're working on, rejuvenating cellular cells on the cellular level. And when we have the cells outside the body, we have an opportunity to work on them with much higher fidelity. And we're also pursuing this, that we can not only just take out the cells, young cells, and give them to you older, but in the intermediate, we might be able to improve upon them and correct damage. So that's where we're doing. That's where we're headed. And so on a personal level, I made the transition, about a year or so ago from a lab grant-funded scientist to somebody starting a longevity startup. And was brought on by what I was seeing happening, but it was also brought on by something that's I feel very powerfully that this is a problem. We share a problem that we don't talk about, even though it's like, it really defines so much of our culture. And that problem, the way I see it, is that we have what it feels like an immortal consciousness, but we have a mortal body. We feel like we should live forever, but our bodies don't. And my grandmother, in 3 days, she's going to turn 92. I've got one left grandparent. And she said to me like a year ago, she said, Mark, I feel like the same person I was when I was 18. I feel like that. And she said, where did the time go? She said, what happened? And to be honest, this is the first year that she couldn't come to our family cottage. And it's not because she doesn't want to. It's because of the decline in her health. She wasn't able to go. She wasn't able to make the trip. And there's been no decline in her desire to spend time with her loved ones. There was no decline in her desire to enjoy the life that she had. And so I'm personally moved by this problem. We all are. I think we've, especially as a culture, have experienced age-related disease more. I think what we've done is we've told ourselves stories to deal with it. We kind of have to. These are therapies to deal with this thing that's facing us. And sometimes we conflate, I think, the wisdom of age with what age looks like, and the experience of like the aches and pains of age. And if age, we call it the golden years, but if aging was a product, nobody would buy it. Like, if you were given the option in any given year, and someone said, "Hey, how about you could either age this year a little more, or you don't have to," you'd be like, "I don't have to. I won't age this year." If you take it year to year, and interestingly, so we're out here. I mean, we're based in Michigan, and we have operations like in North Carolina and stuff. And we're out in the valley. We talk about what we're doing and this problem that we see, and we get a lot of like, "Cool, awesome, yeah, knock it out." Like, but in Michigan and some of the places in the Midwest, we often get like people like different looks. People say, "What? You're taking?" And so there's got to be a shift that has to occur culturally too as this happens. But I don't want to be unrealistic. It's a difficult problem. And as a physicist, turned biologist, I see it as like through thermodynamics. You can't take a system and really turn that system and its surroundings to its initial state. You got entropy to deal with. And so there's disorder whenever you're trying to create order. DNA repair, kind of easy. Queen repair, not so easy. And what you have to deal with, if you're trying to revert a system so complex to an earlier state, you have to deal with what you've created in that process. You have to all of the complexities and really almost the exhaust of the process, and that is going to create obstacles on this path. And for instance, so CRISPR is a technology that many people are aware with. This new gene editing technology. Well, we just are starting to uncover that CRISPR, when you use it in an organism, there might be some other interactions and leading to some. You might be not just editing the gene you wanted to edit. You might be editing a bunch of other genes. Mother Nature is extremely efficient. She doesn't use the one thing for only one purpose in biology. There's generally a lot of different loops and shared mechanisms, and that makes this a difficult problem to address. What we're going to do first is we're going to slow the aging process before we're going to start to turn it backwards. For that reason, I strongly believe, but at least to a great extent. So we've developed this is like kind of a hack, right? Not enough technology. We're freezing youth so we can have a leg up. Worst case scenario, you've got young cells to treat age-related disease, but what we really want to do is first attack the decline in the stem cell niche, and then from there, having this youthful biology, we can apply some of these new technologies. So I have my 40-year-old cells banked, and I'm 42, and it would be very difficult for me to get 40-year-old cells, my own 40-year-old cells now, unless they were not in Franklin, Massachusetts. And so by doing that, we kind of create this asset that we can work upon and we can draw upon. And so I think we'll be able to accelerate the the application of some of these technologies that are in the pipeline by doing what we're doing. That's part of it. Also, to be honest, I think that by finding people that are interested in taking action now about their future health, that kind of are minded that way, they're forward-leaning, that we also create a kind of a cultural shift. We get a community of people that are just thinking about themselves and their health a little bit differently. And I think that's going to be important because we have a big transition culturally that's going to come with this technological transition. So what's going to happen is we're going to move to health maintenance. And we at Forever Labs, that's our goal, is to precipitate this, to make this happen faster, do what we can. And what's going to come with it is a change in the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about aging. I think in a couple generations, you're going to have kids, and they're going to look at this picture, and they'll say, why does everybody decide to have white hair? And why are they sitting in chairs with wheels? It's truly going to change, who we are. And I think for the better, because this is not great. So thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. And happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Mark. We had a few questions submitted ahead of time on the Dory, but if there are live questions, we also have microphones here.
Go ahead, ask.
I have a mic right here.
Okay. 18 years ago, I wrote a screenplay based on multiple sources saying that people like Henry Kissinger were purchasing fetal tissue from the multiple sources where it's available, as we've seen with Planned Parenthood. There's multiple places. And intravenously ingesting it, so basically you have a cannibalism of the young. What keeps this from going in that direction?
Well, hopefully the difference in immunity will slow us down, and our conscience should slow us down too.
But you notice how he never ages? He's just
Kissinger.
he just.
So
I don't know what his story is, but he's amazing.
Yeah,
he always looks the same. You go back to those old pictures and compare to the new pictures, it's like, wow, it's the same
you're
guy.
right. He's what is that guy? The Comte de Saint Germain? Maybe that's who he is. So yeah, I think if we step one is I believe is this, that we can draw on our own biology, and there are ways, you might have heard of, the young blood effect. There's a trial called the Ambrosia trial where they're taking young plasma from patients, donors, and people are treating themselves to see if they can, have effect upon their aging biomarkers, their biology, and rejuvenate it. And interestingly, so the bone marrow, especially the mesenchymal stem cell that I was talking about, releases a lot of soluble factors into the blood that affect the state of the body. And we're actually pretty confident that part of the young blood effect that you see, and this happens, like what they'll do is they'll take an old mouse and a young mouse, and it's really grisly. They'll put their their circulatory systems together, and but they'll see rejuvenation in the old mouse from this young blood donation. And the bone marrow gives birth to most of what's in the blood, and we do think that if you can rejuvenate the bone marrow, you're going to get kind of an autologous young blood effect. So yeah, I guess that is a tough question. What's going to stop us from? Well, hopefully a lot of things to stop us from doing other things like that.
Is there any truth to all those?
The young blood?
Yeah, the fetal tissue.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I have spoken to some people that I think there's some people that have done some kind of crazy stuff. I don't know about. I can't speak to Henry Kissinger.
I've talked to some doctors who believe this.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll say this. Young cells, I've done in the lab, I've taken the soluble factors from young cells and treated old cells with them. And you do see some kind of rejuvenative effect. There's a way that young biology can kind of encourage old biology to act a little more young. But I can't, specifically say like that.
I was just wondering if you could comment on how you think basic human habits like what we eat, exercise, sex even, I've heard like having orgasms, having many orgasms like makes you live shorter. I've heard that. I don't know. So could you just comment on this and just give advice and what you should and should not do to live longer?
Did you also grow up Catholic? I kid. No, so I think there's evidence for caloric restriction in a lot of animals, even up to rhesus monkeys. There's pretty good evidence. It's difficult in humans to see longevity. That takes a long time. There's some evidence, though, that caloric restriction, so just not overeating and keeping it to, I'm not a nutritionist, but a lot of those, it's a moving target, nutritional guidance. And there is evidence from flatworms all the way up to the rhesus monkey that if you keep your caloric restriction at about 2/3 of what normally they would normally eat if they're just able to get food, and that seems to have some benefit. And that's actually something that I keep my calories down. Diet and exercise, that's, yeah. And there's actually been a lot of studies using mice and exercising them and looking at that effect upon their health span is generally what you affect better. Not overall lifespan as much, but health span. It seems that once you get to the 100 and so year point, genetics really starts to take over and to determine who's going to be around, who's not. I think it's interesting. I think it's a very interesting question. I didn't mention this, but so this is something that's always we use mice, right, and rats, and because their biology is so similar. But a mouse and a rat lives 2 years. If their biology is so similar, why do they live 2 years? And it begs the question: is this decline partially programmatic? And can we play with that? I have a 5-year-old daughter. She seems to be growing up rather than old right now. And she's got a biology very similar to mine. What is that? When is, and is there some kind of, are these mechanisms that we can play with at that switching point? So, yeah, I guess I went on beyond your question.
So my question is, fundamentally, what is aging? Is there some sort of counter in the cell that just accumulates the number of cell divisions? Or is there like a number of cell divisions each cell has, in which case it gets kind of cleaned up by the immune system? Like
yeah,
what is it?
I think that question is not settled, but there are things that, divisions in the cell, every division, will risk some kind of error. So you can begin to build up an error. We have certain things that our cells do. They generate garbage, and then they will throw the garbage out and incinerate it, but sometimes some garbage is sticky and it builds up. So sometimes it correlates well to time, but our journeys around the sun, but like it's not driven by that. It just relates to it. And there's ways that you can play with the biology, and you can get it to relate less to time. So yeah, there's an interesting. So there's a thing called the Hayflick limit, which is, in cell culture, it was kind of thought that after about 60 divisions, cells will just cease to divide in culture. But that's not always the case. So our hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow, they actually divide way more than the Hayflick limit throughout our lifetime. And mesenchymal stem cells are pretty sensitive to this culture conditions. We're already finding culture conditions which you can divide them in, and they can go further upon. So it's really a matter of like, not the time, but how much the cell is working to keep itself, retain it and keep itself youthful. And there is a really interesting question of why, what is that? Are these trigger points? Can we tweak them? Yeah.
Question from the Dory.
Sure.
What core scientific breakthroughs need to be made for your technology to actually work? Mm-hmm. What are the downsides?
Well, ideally, we can do what happened in the mice. Ideally, we can take our young bone marrow stem cells and we can just give them IV like they did to our cells. And actually, when you do this, a lot of the cells will hone back to the bone, incorporate. And ideally, that will provide a rejuvenative effect. And I will consider that working. If we get increased health span, I'll consider that working. If we get an increase in lifespan like the mice, I'll think that is incredible. But there are things that we could do. So I mentioned those senescent cells, these cells that turn off, and they kind of negatively impact the tissue around them. Well, there's some work, and there's actually a couple companies here in this area that are working on clearing out those cells. And there's reason to believe that if we could maybe couple clearing that with the rejuvenation at the same time, we might amp it up. So a lot of this is going to be stepwise. I think that there's no great wall that we need to get over, because I think it's many different hurdles, and we're going to knock them down. And often people will talk about the escape velocity. So if you can de-age yourself faster than you age, then you made it. And so I don't think there's one big thing blocking this, but countless.
Hi, so there's kind of a classic bioethics problem of how you account for racial and economic disparity when you're developing technologies like this.
Mm-hmm.
How do you continue to work without leaving poor people behind? Should living longer be something that only the rich can afford to do and have? And how do you balance that as you develop your own company?
Definitely. Yeah. So I came from a middle class family, and we had middle class healthcare. I think so. It depends. A lot of technologies are available so that people can pay for them first, right? Even cell phones or whatnot. And that's going to be the case here. The funding is not set up. Like I said, the healthcare system is not set up to deliver these technologies aggressively to the greater population. They need to be proven. And in order to be proven, you need people willing to take a risk, and it's going to be the private sector. But they better funnel down. They have to funnel down. I mean, that's the point. I think that, and this is just a philosophical thing. I think everything should funnel down. Otherwise, you're going to create a situation that's untenable. Everybody, should have access, but it's going to be the people that are willing to take the risk on this are going to be private, are private. But yeah, I think it's interesting though. So once you increase the lifespan of people, you drastically decrease the number of children that they have. And as in developing countries, it changes the economics pretty drastically. That once the economic situation is such that they're doing better, then you tend to have less children. And I think it'll be interesting to see if that's what happens if we. I think one thing that's interesting about this is if we're living longer, we're going to think longer term, and something maybe like global, warming is an issue that if you're going to be there, you're going to think about it. You think about it a different way. But yeah, I think it remains to be seen. But I do think it's important.
Another question from the door. Oh.
We have one question back here.
Hey,
Sure.
actually, I have two quick questions. So the first is, for those of us considering to bank stem cells with you guys, a lot of us would want to keep them around for 30, 40, 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And since you guys are a startup, how do we know that they'll still be around?
Great question.
Yeah.
So we've actually been searching for an insurance company that will basically take us, so if we go out of business, we get a premium that'll cover the cost of itself for the rest of life. But we actually charge so what we do is the way we're working at it right now is there's an annual storage fee. And we've hit parity now that what our clients are paying in the fee covers the cost. And so we're looking to create a mechanism where we'll spin it off. So if for some reason we crashed and burned as a startup, we would still have this entity that everybody paid into, and they have their cells going there. Still stored there. My cells are in there. My wife's cells are in there. This is important to us that we're going to keep doing this, keep them there. But it's a good question. I'm trying to, if anybody knows an insurance company that wants to write us a new kind of premium, let me know, new kind of plan. But yeah, it's something that we absolutely are trying to cover, and that's how we're approaching it right now. We've had people ask. They're all in Massachusetts. There's an FDA group, compliant by repository, but a lot of people said, well, I want my cells on actually both coasts. I just want them in Massachusetts.
Okay. Second quick question was, I know you guys have only been doing this for about a year, but have you been able to successfully freeze someone's stem cells and then thaw them?
Oh, yeah.
And then actually put them to use?
Well, not put them to use. So to put them to use in the U.S., we have to be part of an FDA-registered clinical trial. But yeah, we've grown them and we freeze them, we've thawed them, I've grown my own. I have more outside me than inside me, just as a matter of experiment. But yeah, it's actually the technology, like that reviewer said, doesn't use enough technology. It's pretty simple stuff.
Thanks.
A recent experiment extended the lifespan of older mice by 10 to 15% by implanting neural stem cells into the hypothalamus. Can BMSCs be induced to differentiate into neural stem cells?
Great question, Dan. So some people will tell you yes. We tried it a lot. A lot of groups tried it, and we didn't. You're trying to get to a different germ layer of cells. But we've seen them express neural proteins. We've seen them fuse with neural cells, but not actually become functional neural cells. However, there was a study recently, just last week, I think, about the hypothalamus, and this was really interesting. Yeah, so they found that by clearing the stem cells in the hypothalamus, they make the animals age more quickly. By rejuvenating those cells, they could actually extend the lifespan of the mice. And the hypothalamus is fascinating. One thing I'm interested, so the mesenchymal stem cell has a powerful effect on these inflammatory cells in the brain called the microglia. And it's one reason why we were interested in them in stroke and traumatic brain injury, because you get microglia, these macrophage cells, and they actually will start to cause death of neural stem cells. And so we're interested in whether or not young MSCs, so one of the reasons that the hypothalamus degrades over time is you get this burden of microglial cells in the hypothalamus. So we're interested, can these cells be used to actually reduce that burden? It's a good question.
So if you increase the lifespan of many, many people, if this becomes successful and widespread, then the problem of overpopulation is going to get a lot worse. Do you have any thoughts on how we're going to deal with this?
Yeah, me personally, no. But I do wonder at that. Will we have fewer children or not? And but that's a lot. There's a lot in that, I don't know. I mean, yeah. I mean, maybe we'll. I mean, the trip won't be such a big deal, right? I mean, the thing is, I think what we need to think about, because this is going to happen, and I think what we have to think about is not whether or not we should do it, because I don't think we're going to reach consensus on whether or not we should do it. I think what we can do is we can talk about, well, when it happens, how do we deal with it? And we should talk about that. And so we have the best outcomes, yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, so thanks for answering my hypothalamus question. As a follow-up, how feasible would it be to extract neural stem cells?
Yeah, it's difficult. We are not credentialing neurologists at the time. And that procedure is a lot more invasive. You want to say? So this guy's got this T-shirt here, which there's only one way you can get this T-shirt. I asked him, it's okay.
Use it for the camera.
I asked him beforehand, otherwise that's a HIPAA violation. There's only one way to get that T-shirt. You want your neural stem cells out? We'll talk. Yeah.
Procedure, right?
Yeah. It's. So there's a thing called induced pluripotency, and where you can take a cell, not a stem cell even sometimes, and you can express some genes and you can get it to have a stem-like state. And then you can take that and make it a neural stem cell. However, right now, we're not very good at it. The way that we express the genes is not very subtle. And those, more often than not, cells produced that way will turn into what we call a teratoma, kind of uncontrolled. They don't behave unlike stem cells when they should behave unlike stem cells. But that is one of those technologies we're getting better at. So when we do get to that point, having youthful cells that are undamaged, especially if they're multipotent, you don't have to go as far to get them there. So that's one way that might be addressed, rather than going into your brain.
Right. So, hi. So I have 2 questions, a short one, a long one. A short one first. When you extract stem cells, won't that have an effect on the organism? Much like you keep them and then it helps you afterwards, won't it actually hurt you to remove them?
So yeah, we take very little. So for a bone marrow transplant, if you do it by the method at which an aspiration, they'll take about 800 milliliters, cc's of bone marrow. We take about 60 cc's, so that's just like 10%. It's about 2% of your overall bone marrow, blood-making bone marrow. So very few of your cells actually have to divide to replace what's lost. And it's kind of like donating blood. It's often considered like an advanced blood draw. It's not a, so no.
Okay, and the long one is, surely you've heard of Aubrey de Grey, the guy with
course,
the longevity, escape velocity, and all that.
Good guy.
And his latest idea to cure cancer is to remove telomerase from the genome, essentially. Like you cannot make telomerase, and then make stem cells that have it in the lab, and then just get a shot of those through every so often. Right. What do you think of the idea?
I think it's one of those things where delivery is going to be tough. I really think thinking about things in that way is really cool. You use this completely counterintuitive approach. But I do think it's complicated by getting the cells to the right place, and then, gosh, you're going to come back. Also, the telomeres themselves and the rate of change of the telomeres actually is a signal for other expression of other genes in the cells. And so I think that if you did that, if you were just turning telomerase off, that you might have these effects, you might induce effects that based on regulatory mechanisms that are looking at them and looking through the rate of change. That's one of those things. It's whenever you're dealing with biology, you want to do one thing, you want to affect one thing, and then you find out it was a stool, it was a leg, and it was another stool that you weren't aware of, and so I think that, but I think it's a very, it's a cool approach, and but actually I had to talk to him about it. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and thanks, Mark, for talking at Google.
Thanks, Sean.